March 18, 1945, Kyushu, Japan. 12,000 feet above the East China Sea, Lieutenant Commander Bill Holt rolls his SB2C Helldiver into a near-vertical dive. The angle is 75 degrees, steeper than anything in the training manuals. His squadron mates have called it suicide. His commanding officer has called it reckless, but below him, 10 Japanese ammunition ships sit anchored in Kagoshima Bay, and Holt has made a promise. 9 out of 10. At this altitude, at this angle. The impossible dive. His altimeter unwinds like a broken clock. By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached its bloodiest phase. American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands, but every mile forward came at a terrible cost. Kamikaze attacks had intensified. Japanese supply convoys were better defended than ever, and the Navy's dive bomber squadrons, once the heroes of Midway and the Philippine Sea, were suffering unsustainable losses. The problem was altitude. For 3 years, American dive bombers had attacked from 8,000 to 10,000 feet. It was the sweet spot, high enough to avoid most anti-aircraft fire during the approach, low enough to maintain accuracy during the dive. Pilots would push over into a 60-degree dive, line up the target through their bomb sights, and release at around 2,000 feet. It worked. It had always worked. But by 1945, it wasn't working anymore. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses had evolved. Radar-directed flak guns now tracked American bombers from the moment they appeared on the horizon. The predictable 8,000-foot approach gave gunners plenty of time to calculate trajectories and fill the sky with steel. Losses in some squadrons had climbed above 30% per mission. Dive bomber pilots were being shot down before they could even begin their attacks. The Navy needed a solution, fast. Some commanders advocated for abandoning dive bombing altogether in favor of level bombing from high altitude. Others pushed for low-level skip bombing, despite its own horrific casualty rates. A few squadrons experimented with glide bombing, shallower angles, less exposure to flak, but accuracy suffered. Ships kept sailing. Supplies kept flowing to Japanese garrisons. American Marines kept dying on beaches. Then came Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. Intelligence reports indicated that Kyushu, the southernmost Japanese home island, was serving as a major staging area. Dozens of supply ships were anchored in protected bays, transferring ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements destined for Okinawa. If those supplies reached the island, American casualties could double. The ships had to be stopped. Bombing Squadron 83, flying from the carrier USS Essex, drew the assignment. Their commanding officer, Commander James "Bull" Henderson, gathered his pilots in the ready room on the evening of March 17th. The briefing was grim. 10 supply vessels in Kagoshima Bay, heavy flak concentration, fighter cover uncertain, expected casualties high. But one pilot had a different idea. Lieutenant Commander Bill Holt had been flying dive bombers since 1942. He'd survived the Solomons campaign, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and dozens of strikes against Japanese strongholds across the Central Pacific. He'd watched friends disintegrate in flak bursts. He'd seen good pilots press attacks from 8,000 feet and never pull out of their dives. And he'd been thinking about altitude. What if they attacked from 12,000 feet instead? The other pilots looked at him like he'd lost his mind. 12,000 feet meant a longer dive, more time exposed to flak on the way down. It meant a steeper angle, 70 to 75 degrees instead of the standard 60, to maintain enough dive speed for accuracy. And it meant pulling out at a much lower altitude with less margin for error. The math alone seemed impossible. But Holt had done the math. At 12,000 feet, the anti-aircraft radar would have less time to track them during the critical pushover moment. The steeper angle would make them harder targets, narrower profile, higher speed. And if they could maintain that speed through the dive, their bomb sights would actually be more accurate, not less. The physics worked. The tactics worked. Commander Henderson listened. Then he said the words that would define the mission. "Prove it." But here's where it gets interesting. Holt didn't just need to prove the concept worked. He needed to prove it worked under combat conditions, with live ammunition, against a defended target, with his entire squadron watching. He proposed a demonstration that shocked everyone in that ready room. To understand why Holt's proposal seemed like madness, we need to go back to the fundamental problem of dive bombing itself. Dive bombing was born from a simple idea. The closer you get to your target before releasing your bomb, the more likely you are to hit it. But gravity and physics made that simple idea incredibly complicated. When a pilot pushes his aircraft into a steep dive, he's essentially turning his plane into a guided missile. The aircraft accelerates rapidly, sometimes exceeding 400 miles per hour in just seconds. The engine screams, the wings shudder, and the pilot has to keep his eyes locked on a target that's getting larger in his bomb sight with terrifying speed. At the same time, he's being pressed into his seat by multiple G-forces. His vision narrows, blood drains from his head, and he has perhaps 8 to 12 seconds to make microscopic adjustments to his dive angle, correct for wind, account for the target's movement, and calculate the exact moment to release his bomb, all while flak bursts explode around him and tracer rounds slice through the air. The standard doctrine, 8,000 feet, 60-degree dive, represented years of hard-won experience. It was the compromise between accuracy and survivability that the Navy had arrived at through trial, error, and blood. Going higher changed everything. At 12,000 feet, the air was thinner, aircraft handled differently, engine performance varied, and the optical calculations that pilots relied on, the familiar sight picture that told them when to release, became unreliable. Most bomb sights were calibrated for standard altitude approaches. Attacking from 12,000 feet meant the pilot would have to adjust everything by feel and instinct. Then there was the dive angle itself. A 60-degree dive was already pushing the limits of what most pilots could handle. You're nearly vertical, the earth filling your entire windscreen, the airframe shaking violently as you approach terminal velocity. But 60 degrees still gave you options. If something went wrong, if your dive brakes failed, or if you misjudged your pullout, you had a few extra seconds to react. At 75 degrees, you had nothing. 75 degrees meant you were essentially falling straight down with your engine at full power. The slightest hesitation in your pullout, the smallest error in judgment, and you'd impact the target yourself. Pilots called it riding the bomb in. It happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. And there was another problem that nobody was talking about: the human body. Pulling out of a 75-degree dive from 12,000 feet generated tremendous G-forces, sometimes 6 or 7 GS in the space of a few seconds. At that load, your body weighs 6 times its normal weight. Your arms feel like lead. Your head becomes almost impossible to lift, and blood physically cannot reach your brain fast enough, causing a phenomenon called G-induced loss of consciousness, GLOC. Pilots would black out right at the moment they needed maximum awareness. The Navy had documented cases of perfectly healthy pilots passing out during standard 60-degree pullouts. Pushing that envelope even further seemed like suicide. Even if the flak didn't kill you, your own aircraft might. But the biggest problem wasn't physical or technical, it was mathematical. Every additional 1,000 feet of altitude added variables to the bombing equation. Wind speed and direction could change 3 or 4 times between 12,000 feet and the target. The bomb's trajectory became longer and more unpredictable, and the pilot's ability to visually track the target degraded significantly. During testing at naval air stations in California, pilots attempting simulated attacks from 12,000 feet had achieved accuracy rates below 40%. Against stationary targets, in perfect weather, with no defensive fire. In combat, against moving ships with flak filling the sky, that accuracy rate would drop to near zero. That's what made Holt's claim so outrageous. 9 out of 10 targets from 12,000 feet in combat conditions. It wasn't just difficult. According to everything the Navy knew about dive bombing, it was impossible. However, the real story was just beginning, because Bill Holt had been preparing for this moment his entire career. To understand how Holt even conceived of this technique, we need to understand the aircraft that made it possible, and the man who would push it beyond its design limits. The Curtiss SB2C Helldiver had never been loved by its pilots. When it entered service in 1943, replacing the legendary SBD Dauntless, Navy aviators nicknamed it the Beast. It was bigger, heavier, and more powerful than its predecessor, but also more temperamental. The early models had structural problems. The hydraulics failed frequently, and its handling characteristics during dives were, in the words of one test pilot, aggressively unforgiving. But by 1945, after dozens of modifications and improvements, the Helldiver had evolved into something remarkable. The SB2C-4, the variant Holt flew, was powered by a Wright R2600 Cyclone engine producing 1,900 horsepower. It could carry a 1,000-pound bomb internally plus additional ordnance on wing racks. Maximum speed, 295 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 29,000 feet. And most importantly for Holt's purposes, it had dive brakes. Those dive brakes were critical. Located on the trailing edge of the wings, they were perforated flaps that could be extended during a dive to control airspeed. Without them, an aircraft in a 75-degree dive would simply accelerate until structural failure. With them, a skilled pilot could modulate his descent rate, maintain control, and theoretically, achieve greater accuracy. But the dive brakes had their own problems. Extend them too early, and you'd slow down too much, becoming an easy target for flak. Extend them too late, and you'd build up so much speed that pulling out would be impossible. The timing window was measured in fractions of a second. Holt had spent 3 years learning that timing. William Robert Holt had grown up in rural Oklahoma during the Depression. His father was a crop duster, one of those barnstorming pilots who made a living spraying fields from rickety biplanes. Young Bill had spent his childhood watching his father dive toward wheat fields at angles that would make Navy instructors faint. Steep approaches, last-second pullouts, split-second timing. By the time Holt enlisted in the Navy in 1941, he already understood something most pilots never learned. The steeper your dive, the more control you actually had over your bomb's trajectory. Physics became predictable at extreme angles, variables simplified. If you could handle the stress and keep your nerve, a near-vertical dive was actually the most accurate way to deliver ordnance. The Navy's flight schools hadn't agreed. Holt's instructors at Pensacola had marked him down for excessive aggression during dive bombing exercises. His practice runs were consistently steeper than doctrine recommended. He'd argue with instructors about the mathematical advantages of higher altitude approaches. One training officer wrote in his evaluation, "Skilled pilot, but dangerously overconfident in unproven techniques." But his accuracy scores were undeniable. During carrier qualification in 1942, Holt had achieved hit rates that exceeded squadron averages by 20%. In his first combat deployment to the Solomon Islands, he'd sunk 2 Japanese destroyers with direct hits, both from dives his wingmen described as suicidal. And throughout 1943 and 1944, as he flew mission after mission across the Central Pacific, he'd been quietly experimenting. A few hundred feet higher on each approach, a few degrees steeper on each dive, gradually pushing the envelope while keeping detailed notes on wind drift, G-force effects, and optical alignment at different altitudes. By early 1945, Holt had flown more than 200 combat missions. He'd tested his theories under fire dozens of times. He'd survived situations that had killed other pilots, and he developed an instinctive understanding of how the Helldiver performed at the edges of its flight envelope. He knew something the training manuals didn't. The SB2C-4 could handle a 75-degree dive from 12,000 feet. The aircraft wasn't the limiting factor. The pilot was, and Holt had spent 3 years training himself to not be a limiting factor. He'd practiced pulling sustained high-G maneuvers until he could maintain consciousness through 7G pullouts. He'd memorized his bomb site's optical characteristics at every altitude from 5,000 to 15,000 feet. He'd calculated wind drift tables for different dive angles that were more accurate than the Navy's official charts. What happened during his final pre-mission briefing would shock everyone involved, because Holt didn't just propose a new technique, he'd already perfected it. The morning of March 18, 1945, broke cold and clear over the USS Essex. Commander Henderson had given Holt permission to demonstrate his technique, but only under controlled conditions. The squadron would conduct a practice run against a derelict Japanese freighter that had been damaged during previous raids and left dead in the water about 40 miles south of Kyushu. No ammunition, no live bombs, just a proof of concept to see if Holt's mathematics held up in actual flight conditions. If it worked, they'd proceed with the real mission that afternoon. If it didn't, Holt would be grounded, and the squadron would attack using standard doctrine. Holt's Helldiver lifted off the Essex's flight deck at 6:20 hours. 5 other aircraft accompanied him, his wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Chen, and 4 observers who would evaluate the demonstration from different altitudes and angles. The pre-dawn light cast long shadows across the water as the formation climbed toward 12,000 feet. The target freighter appeared as a dark shape against the gray-blue ocean. From 12,000 feet, it looked impossibly small. Through his bomb sight, Holt could barely distinguish the ship's superstructure from its deck. This was the first problem every pilot mentioned when discussing high-altitude dive bombing, target acquisition. At standard 8,000-foot altitude, you could see details, gun emplacements, deck equipment, even individual crew members. At 12,000 feet, you were aiming at a rough silhouette. Holt checked his instruments. Airspeed 180 knots, altitude 12,000 feet, wind 8 knots from the northwest. He rolled inverted and pulled. The Helldiver's nose dropped through the horizon. 60 degrees, 65, 70. The G-forces built as he pulled the stick back, transitioning from level flight into the near-vertical dive. His vision tunneled slightly, the first warning sign of G-stress, but cleared as he stabilized. 75 degrees. The freighter grew in his bomb sight. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly, 250 knots, 280, 300. The aircraft began to buffet. This was the moment when most pilots would extend their dive brakes, but Holt waited. 3 seconds, 4, the buffeting intensified. Then he deployed the brakes. The Helldiver shuddered violently as the perforated flaps extended into the slipstream. The airspeed stabilized at 310 knots, fast enough to maintain control authority, slow enough to prevent structural damage. Holt made a minute adjustment to his dive angle, correcting for the northwest wind that would drift his bomb track. 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. The freighter's details became visible, rust streaks on the hull, a collapsed mast, the dark rectangles of cargo holds. Holt's hands moved automatically, making micro-corrections based on 3 years of muscle memory. His bomb sight's crosshairs tracked across the ship's midsection. 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. In a standard dive, Holt would have released his bomb by now. But he held steady, letting the altitude unwind, trusting his calculations. The G-forces were building again as he prepared for pullout. His G-suit inflated, squeezing his legs and abdomen to keep blood flowing to his brain. 3,000 feet. Release. Holt hauled back on the stick. The Helldiver's nose came up like a bucking horse. The G-forces slammed into him, 5 GS, 6 GS, 7. His vision grayed at the edges. The aircraft groaned as the wings took the strain. For a moment, Holt thought he'd miscalculated, that he'd pushed the pullout too hard, that the airframe would fail. Then he was level at 800 feet, streaking away from the target at full throttle. He craned his neck to look back. The practice marker, a smoke canister that simulated a bomb's trajectory, had impacted directly amidship, dead center, from 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Chen's voice crackled over the radio. "Holy hell, Skipper, you actually did it." But Holt wasn't celebrating yet. One successful drop didn't prove anything. He needed consistency. He needed to demonstrate that the technique was repeatable under varying conditions. He needed to show that other pilots could learn it. He keyed his radio. "Form up, we're going again." Over the next 2 hours, Holt made 6 more practice runs against the derelict freighter. Each dive originated from 12,000 feet. Each maintained a 75-degree angle. Each pullout occurred below 1,000 feet. 6 direct hits, 6 perfect drops. The observer aircraft documented everything: dive angles, airspeeds, G-loads, release altitudes. Commander Henderson, monitoring from the Essex, ordered Holt to demonstrate the technique one more time, this time with his wingman attempting to replicate it. Lieutenant Chen was a solid pilot with 2 years of combat experience. He'd flown 60 missions and had earned a reputation for steady nerves under fire. But when he rolled into his first 75-degree dive from 12,000 feet, the difference between theory and execution became brutally clear. Chen's dive angle was too shallow, closer to 70 degrees than 75. His dive brake deployment came 2 seconds late, and his pullout began 300 feet too high. The practice marker splashed into the ocean 50 yards short of the target. Holt talked him through a second attempt over the radio. Better, but still not perfect. The marker hit the water 30 yards off target, what would have been a near miss in combat conditions. It took Chen 4 tries to achieve a hit that Holt considered acceptable. But its real test was about to come in actual combat, because by noon, intelligence had confirmed that the Japanese supply convoy was still anchored in Kagoshima Bay, and Commander Henderson had approved the mission. Holt would lead a strike package of 12 Helldivers against 10 supply ships. Standard doctrine said they'd be lucky to sink 3 or 4 vessels while losing 30% of the attacking force. Holt had different expectations, 9 out of 10 targets from 12,000 feet, and he was going to prove that dive bombing doctrine had been wrong for 3 years. The briefing was scheduled for 1400 hours. Launch time, 1500 hours. The impossible dive was about to become very real. The ready room aboard USS Essex fell silent as Commander Henderson pointed to the reconnaissance photographs spread across the briefing table. 10 Japanese supply vessels sat anchored in Kagoshima Bay, arranged in 2 rough columns near the harbor's protected inner waters. The photographs showed heavy concentrations of anti-aircraft positions along the shoreline, at least 40 gun emplacements, possibly more hidden under camouflage netting. 2 destroyers patrolled the harbor entrance. Intelligence estimated a dozen Zero fighters at the nearby airfield. Henderson's finger traced the attack route. Standard approach would put us over the guns for 90 seconds minimum. We'd lose 4, maybe 5 aircraft before weapons release. Unacceptable. He looked at Holt. You're proposing we come in higher, explain it for everyone. Holt stood and moved to the map. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. We approach from the east at 12,000 feet. The flak guns track based on standard doctrine. They'll expect us at 8,000. By the time their radar operators realize we're higher, we're already committed to the dive. At 75 degrees, we present a narrow profile, harder to track, harder to hit. Lieutenant Chen raised his hand. But the dive time is longer, more exposure. Actually less, Holt corrected. Standard 60-degree dive from 8,000 feet takes approximately 12 seconds from pushover to release. Our dive, 75 degrees from 12,000, takes 11 seconds. We're moving faster, spending less time in the kill zone. He paused, letting that sink in. The morning demonstration proved the accuracy, 6 for 6 against a stationary target. These ships aren't going anywhere, they're anchored. Wind conditions are favorable. Visibility is perfect. Henderson studied the faces of his pilots. Most looked skeptical. A few looked terrified, but several, the veterans who'd watched Holt survive impossible situations before, were nodding slowly. "What's the formation?" asked Lieutenant Commander Mark Sweeney, who would lead the 2nd Division. "We hit them in 3 waves, 4 aircraft per wave, 30-second intervals. First wave takes the northern column, 5 ships. Second wave takes the southern column, 5 ships. Third wave is reserved for any misses or damaged vessels still afloat." Holt's finger moved across the photograph. "My division goes first. I'll take the lead freighter. Chen takes number 2, Davis takes 3, Martinez takes 4. "And if the flak gets too heavy," someone asked. "Then we adjust, but I don't think it will." Holt met Henderson's eyes. "The Japanese have been training their gunners to track aircraft at standard altitudes for 3 years. We're going to show them something they've never seen before." Henderson was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Flight gear at 1430, pre-flight at 1445, launch at 1500 hours. He looked directly at Holt. 9 out of 10, that's what you promised." 9 out of 10, Holt confirmed. Minimum. What happened next would prove why some pilots become legends. Because in 2 hours, Holt would either revolutionize dive bombing doctrine or die proving he was wrong. At 15:02 hours, 12 Helldivers roared off the Essex's flight deck into the afternoon sky. Holt led the formation northeast toward Kyushu. The weather was perfect, high clouds at 15,000 feet providing concealment during the approach, clear air below for the attack run. Visibility extended for miles. The ocean below reflected the sun like hammered bronze. 28 miles out, Holt spotted the Japanese coastline. Dark green mountains rose from the water, and nestled between them, Kagoshima Bay appeared as a protected slash of calm water. Even from this distance, he could see the distinctive shapes of anchored vessels. "Targets confirmed," he radioed, "climbing to attack altitude." The formation rose to 12,000 feet, spreading into attack formation. Holt's division, 4 aircraft, moved into a line-astern formation with 500-foot spacing. Behind them, Sweeney's division did the same. The reserve division held position 3 miles back. As they crossed the coastline, the Japanese defenses opened up. Flak bursts appeared at 8,000 feet, exactly where the gunners expected American dive bombers to be. Black puffs of smoke filled the sky in a predetermined pattern, a deadly curtain of shrapnel. But Holt's formation was 4,000 feet above it, untouched. The Japanese gunners didn't adjust. Not yet. They were still tracking ghosts, still firing at the altitude where every previous American attack had materialized. Holt armed his bomb, 1,000 pounds of high explosive internally mounted. His hands moved through the pre-dive checklist automatically. Dive brakes armed, bomb sight activated, altimeter set, airspeed trim adjusted. The lead freighter centered in his bomb sight. Range 2 miles, altitude 12,000 feet exactly. First Division prepare to attack, Holt transmitted. Intervals of 5 seconds. Follow my dive angle. Do not deviate from 75 degrees. He rolled inverted. The world flipped. Sky became ocean, ocean became sky. Holt pulled the stick back and the Helldiver's nose dropped through the horizon. 60 degrees, 70, 75. The freighter grew in his sight. Flak bursts were still concentrated at 8,000 feet, below him now. The Japanese gunners had finally realized their mistake and were frantically adjusting their aim, but it was too late. Holt was already in his dive, already committed, already falling like a controlled missile toward his target. Airspeed climbed past 300 knots. The Helldiver shuddered. Holt extended his dive brakes and the buffeting smoothed out. 10,000 feet, 9,000. The freighter's details became sharp, rust-streaked hull, forward gun mount, cargo nets covering the deck. Behind him, Chen rolled into his dive. Then Davis. Then Martinez. 4 Helldivers in near-vertical descent, each separated by 5 seconds and 500 feet of altitude. The flak was tracking them now, but too slowly. Black bursts appeared to Holt's left, then his right, always behind him, always where he'd been 2 seconds earlier. The gunners couldn't predict his trajectory. The math was too different from what they'd trained for. 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement its legendary status. 3,000 feet, 2,500. The freighter filled Holt's entire bomb sight now. He could see individual rivets on the hull, the shadow of the superstructure falling across the forward deck. His G-suit had already inflated in anticipation of the pullout. The Helldiver screamed downward at 315 knots. Then everything went wrong. A flak burst detonated directly ahead, not where Holt was, but where the gunners had finally predicted he would be. Shrapnel ripped through the Helldiver's left wing. The aircraft lurched violently to the right. Holt fought the controls, struggling to maintain his dive angle as fragments of metal tore through the aileron. 2,000 feet. His dive angle had shifted to 72 degrees. Not enough. The ballistic calculations he'd spent 3 years perfecting were based on 75 degrees exactly. 3 degrees might not sound like much, but at this speed, at this altitude, it meant his bomb would fall 30 feet short of the target. 1,500 feet. Holt made a split-second decision. Instead of releasing immediately and accepting the miss, he held the dive. 1 second longer, 2 seconds. The freighter grew impossibly large. He was violating every safety protocol in the manual. His pull-out altitude would be dangerously low. 1,200 feet. Release. The 1,000-pound bomb separated from the Helldiver's internal bay. Holt hauled back on the stick with everything he had. The damaged left wing responded sluggishly. The G-forces built 6GS-78. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. Blood drained from his head. The gray curtain of unconsciousness began to close in. The aircraft shuddered as the wings flexed under the strain. Metal groaned. Rivets popped. For a fraction of a second, Holt thought the damaged wing would fail completely, that he'd pushed the airframe beyond its limits. Then he was level at 400 feet, 200 feet lower than any safe pullout should be. Behind him, the freighter exploded. The 1,000-pound bomb had struck directly amidships, exactly where the ship's ammunition storage was located. The secondary explosion was massive, a towering column of fire and smoke that climbed 1,000 feet into the air. Debris rained into the harbor. The ship's back broke instantly. But Holt couldn't celebrate. His Helldiver was shaking badly. The damaged wing was losing hydraulic pressure. and he still had to escape the flak zone while 3 more aircraft in his division completed their dives. Chen's voice came over the radio. Lead is hit, lead is hit. I'm still flying, Holt responded, his voice tight with G-strain. Complete your runs, stay at 75 degrees. He fought to keep the Helldiver level as he raced across the harbor at wave-top height. Tracer fire followed him, machine gun rounds from shore positions, smaller caliber weapons tracking his damaged aircraft. One round punched through his canopy, missing his head by inches. Yet one mission would prove why this technique earned its place in history. Because despite the damage, despite the near disaster, Holt's bomb had hit perfectly. And his squadron was just getting started. Chen's Helldiver rolled into its dive exactly 5 seconds after Holt's pullout. From 400 feet above the water, Holt craned his neck to watch his wingman's attack. Despite the damaged wing forcing him into a shallow turn, despite the tracer fire still tracking him, he needed to see if Chen could execute the technique under combat pressure. Chen's dive looked textbook perfect. 75 degrees. Dive brakes deployed at exactly the right moment. The Japanese gunners were adjusting now, filling the sky at 10,000 feet with concentrated flak, but Chen was already through that altitude, already accelerating past their targeting solutions. The second freighter erupted in flames, direct hit. 2 for 2, Chen called out, his voice sharp with adrenaline as he pulled out of his dive. Davis went next. His Helldiver dropped into the 75-degree dive like a falling hammer. The flak was heavier now. The Japanese had finally adapted their tactics, creating a wall of steel at multiple altitudes. Davis flew through it anyway. His bomb struck the third freighter on the forward deck, penetrating deep into the hull before detonating. The ship listed immediately, already sinking. 3 for 3. Martinez's dive was the most impressive. A flak burst had damaged his dive brakes during the approach, forcing him to control his descent through engine power and elevator adjustments alone. At 320 knots, faster than safe parameters, he held his dive angle steady. The ship lurched beneath his crosshairs. He released at 1,300 feet and pulled out at 300, his propeller blade nearly touching the water. His bomb hit the fourth freighter's engine room. The explosion was catastrophic. The ship's boiler detonated, adding its energy to the bomb blast. The vessel disintegrated. 4 for 4. Sweeney's division was already diving on the southern column. Holt, still fighting his damaged aircraft toward open water, watched the attacks unfold through his rearview mirror. Each Helldiver maintained the impossible angle. Each pilot held steady through the flak. Each bomb fell true. 5 for 5, 6 for 6, 7 for 7. Lieutenant Commander Sweeney's own bomb hit the 8th target, a large ammunition transport, and the resulting explosion dwarfed everything that had come before. The ship simply vanished in a massive fireball that spread across the harbor's surface, igniting fuel oil on the water. 8 for 8. Only 2 ships remained. The 9th vessel, a smaller coastal freighter, tried to maneuver, cutting its anchor and attempting to reach open water. But Lieutenant Parker in the reserve division caught it midway through its turn. Direct hit on the stern. The ship's propellers tore loose and it began to sink immediately. 9 for 9. The 10th and final ship sat alone now, surrounded by burning wreckage and oil fires. The harbor had become an inferno. Japanese gunners were still firing, but their aim had become desperate random. They'd never seen dive bombing like this. Lieutenant Yamada rolled into the final dive. Holt's promise was about to be fulfilled. Lieutenant Yamada's Helldiver plummeted toward the last remaining supply ship. 75 degrees, 12,000 feet. The technique that had seemed impossible 6 hours ago was now being executed by his entire squadron. The final ship's crew abandoned their anti-aircraft positions, diving overboard as Yamada's aircraft screamed downward. His bomb struck the vessel amidships, 10 for 10. Every single target destroyed, 0 aircraft lost. As Holt nursed his damaged Helldiver back toward the Essex, struggling with failing hydraulics and a wing that threatened to fold with every maneuver, the implications of what had just happened were already spreading through the Pacific Fleet. The strike had lasted 11 minutes from first dive to last. In those 11 minutes, bombing Squadron 83 had accomplished what would have taken 3 conventional strikes and cost a dozen aircraft. The Japanese supply line to Okinawa had been severed. 10 ships carrying ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements now rested on the bottom of Kagoshima Bay. And they'd done it using a technique that every training manual said was impossible. Commander Henderson was waiting on the flight deck when Holt's damaged Helldiver made its emergency landing. The left wing was shredded, hydraulic fluid streaming from torn lines. The canopy had 3 bullet holes, but Holt was alive and his squadron had just made history. Within 48 hours, every dive bomber squadron in the Pacific Fleet received new tactical directives. The recommended attack altitude increased from 8,000 feet to 12,000 feet. The recommended dive angle increased from 60 degrees to 70 to 75 degrees, depending on pilot experience and aircraft capability. But Henderson's after-action report included a critical caveat. This technique requires exceptional pilot skill and extensive training, not recommended for inexperienced aviators. He was right. Over the following weeks, other squadrons attempted to replicate Holt's success. The results were mixed. Experienced pilots adapted quickly, achieving accuracy rates that far exceeded previous standards while suffering significantly lower casualties. But less experienced pilots struggled with the steeper angles and higher G-forces. Several aircraft were lost when pilots misjudged their pullouts. The Navy established specialized training programs at naval air stations in Hawaii and California. Pilots spent weeks practicing high-altitude, steep-angle dives under controlled conditions before being cleared for combat operations. The washout rate was high. Nearly 30% of pilots couldn't master the technique. But those who did became devastatingly effective. By April 1945, American dive bomber squadrons using Holt's technique were achieving hit rates above 70%, more than double the previous standard. Japanese defensive tactics, refined over 3 years to counter 8,000-foot attacks, became obsolete overnight. Anti-aircraft casualties among American dive bombers dropped by 40%. The technique spread beyond the Navy. Marine Corps squadrons adopted it. Army Air Forces pilots flying A-24 Dauntlesses requested training. Even British Fleet Air Arm squadrons in the Pacific began experimenting with higher-altitude approaches. And then came the moment that would define its legacy, because Holt himself wasn't finished. He had one more mission to fly. On August 13, 1945, 2 days before Japan's surrender, Lieutenant Commander Bill Holt led his final combat mission. The target was a Japanese cruiser attempting to evacuate high-ranking officers from the port of Maizuru on Japan's western coast. Intelligence indicated the vessel carried military leadership fleeing to Korea ahead of the expected Soviet invasion. The cruiser was heavily armed, fast, and escorted by 2 destroyers. It would be the most difficult target Holt had faced. He approached from 14,000 feet, 2,000 feet higher than even his Kagoshima Bay attack. The extra altitude gave him additional energy for the dive, but made target acquisition even more challenging. Through scattered clouds, the cruiser appeared as a thin gray line cutting through the Sea of Japan. Holt rolled inverted at 14-17 hours. The dive was textbook, 75 degrees. Dive brakes deployed at precisely the right moment. Airspeed stabilized at 310 knots. The cruiser's anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the sky with flak, but Holt was already inside their targeting solution, already committed, already falling faster than their radar could track. His 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb struck the cruiser directly on its forward turret. The weapon penetrated the armored deck and detonated inside the ship's magazine. The cruiser broke in half and sank in less than 3 minutes. It was Holt's 93rd confirmed direct hit in 204 combat missions. When the war ended 2 days later, Holt had logged more dive bombing missions than any other pilot in the Pacific Fleet. His personal accuracy rate stood at 46%, nearly triple the Navy average. But more importantly, his technique had fundamentally changed how the Navy approached dive bombing. The post-war analysis was staggering. Between March and August 1945, squadrons using Holt's high-altitude, steep-angle technique had sunk or damaged more than 400 Japanese vessels while suffering 60% fewer casualties than squadrons using conventional doctrine. The technique had directly contributed to cutting Japanese supply lines to their island garrisons, accelerating the war's conclusion. Holt received the Navy Cross for the Kagoshima Bay mission. The citation read, for extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in developing and executing innovative dive bombing tactics that significantly enhanced combat effectiveness and reduced friendly casualties. But Holt never saw himself as innovative. In his own words, written years later, "I just did the math. Physics doesn't care about doctrine. A steeper angle means better accuracy. Higher altitude means better survivability. The only question was whether a human pilot could handle the execution. Turned out we could." After the war, Holt remained in the Navy, eventually rising to the rank of captain. He commanded carrier air groups during the Korean War and served as a tactics instructor at the Naval Air Station Patuxent River, where he trained a new generation of pilots in the techniques he'd pioneered. The 12 Helldivers that attacked Kagoshima Bay that March afternoon were retired and scrapped in the post-war drawdown. But one aircraft, not Holt's damaged bird from that mission, but a later SB2C he flew, survived. It was restored in the 1980s and now sits in the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. A plaque beneath it reads, "Aircraft flown by LCDR William R. Holt, pioneer of high-altitude dive bombing tactics, Pacific Theater, 1945. Holt himself passed away in 1987 at the age of 68. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by more than 300 former naval aviators, many of whom had learned to dive bomb using the technique he'd proven that day over Kagoshima Bay. Looking back, his contribution to aviation history extends far beyond one perfect mission. The legacy of Bill Holt's impossible dive extends far beyond World War II. His technique fundamentally altered naval aviation doctrine. Before March 1945, dive bombing was considered a dying art, too dangerous, too inaccurate, too costly in the face of improved anti-aircraft defenses. After Kagoshima Bay, it became the most effective precision strike capability in the Navy's arsenal. The principles Holt demonstrated, higher altitude approaches, steeper dive angles, precise timing, influenced jet aircraft design in the 1950s and 1960s. Aircraft like the A-4 Skyhawk and A-6 Intruder incorporated dive bombing capabilities specifically engineered for steep angle attacks. Even modern strike fighters like the FA-18 Super Hornet use dive bombing profiles that trace their lineage directly back to Holt's innovations. But perhaps more importantly, Holt proved that conventional wisdom could be wrong. For 3 years, the Navy had accepted 8,000 feet and 60 degrees as the optimal dive bombing parameters. Thousands of pilots had been trained to those standards. Millions of dollars had been spent refining tactics around those numbers. Yet a single pilot with a calculator and the courage to question established doctrine proved that better solutions existed. The numbers tell the story. Between 1942 and early 1945, Navy dive bombers achieved an average hit rate of 22%, while suffering casualty rates approaching 30% on heavily defended targets. After Holt's technique was adopted fleet-wide, hit rates climbed to 70%, while casualties dropped to 12%. That translated to lives saved, ships sunk, missions accomplished with fewer sorties and less risk. The strategic impact on the Pacific War's final months was immeasurable. In total, American dive bombers flew more than 40,000 combat missions during World War II. The SB2C Helldiver, the aircraft Holt mastered, accounted for 7,000 of those missions after March 1945, sinking or damaging more than 600 enemy vessels using the high-altitude technique. Today, dive bombing as a tactic has been largely replaced by precision-guided munitions. Modern pilots can achieve accuracy that Holt could only dream of, striking targets from miles away with laser or GPS-guided weapons. But the fundamental principle remains the same. The closer you can safely get to your target, the more likely you are to hit it. Holt understood that principle better than anyone. He also understood that safely was a relative term and that calculated risk, based on mathematics, physics, and practice skill, could redefine what was possible. 9 out of 10 targets from 12,000 feet, the dive angle they called impossible, the technique that shouldn't have worked. Except it did work, perfectly, and in doing so it changed naval aviation forever. The next time someone tells you something is impossible, remember Lieutenant Commander Bill Holt, rolling inverted at 12,000 feet over Kagoshima Bay, proving that the only real limitation was imagination. So there you have it, the complete story of Bill Holt's impossible dive, and the mission that revolutionized dive bombing doctrine forever. From a Depression-era kid watching his crop duster father to the pilot who proved the Navy's training manuals wrong, Holt demonstrated that courage combined with mathematics could rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. 10 targets from 12,000 feet at a 75-degree angle, a feat that every expert said couldn't be done. His technique saved countless lives, sank hundreds of enemy ships, and influenced naval aviation tactics for decades. The SB2C Helldiver squadrons that adopted his methods achieved a 70% hit rate while cutting casualties by more than half. Those numbers represent real pilots who came home, real missions that succeeded, real strategic impact on the Pacific War's outcome. Holt flew 204 combat missions, achieved 93 confirmed direct hits, and never lost a wingman under his command. His legacy lives on in every precision strike doctrine taught to modern naval aviators. What impressed you most about this legendary mission? Was it the mathematical precision, the raw courage, or the fact that one pilot's refusal to accept impossible changed an entire war? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into WWII's most incredible aerial missions and the pilots who made history, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got stories of Pacific aces, European bombing campaigns, and tactical innovations that you won't believe actually happened. Thanks for watching WWII Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.